Okay, hi there. My name is Ellen. I will be correcting this essay for you. I see that you have submitted a task 1, so let's take a look. Yeah, admittedly, the image is not that great, but I'm sure I can figure it out. No big deal. So let's see what you wrote. Okay. Fine. So the bar graph demonstrates yearly change of the percentage of households in possessed and rented accommodation in England and Wales from 1918 to 2011. Before 1971, the rate of owned house was larger than the rates of rented one. On the contrary, after 1971, the situation became completely opposite. Okay, this is okay. I mean, there are a few things that I would certainly advise changing. First of all, we call them bar charts. Okay, so we say line graph, but when we're talking about a bar, we call it a chart, not a graph. So I would change that, and I would make sure it said bar chart. And then I would like to see this sentence a little less heavy. So of the percentage of households in possessed in England. So it just feels a little heavy. Also, I wasn't a huge fan of the word possessed. I understand that you're trying to use different vocabulary for the words that are in the chart, but there's sometimes where you really should just use the word that has been given to you because it's the most appropriate, really. Now here the expression was owned and rented accommodation. You wrote possessed, and so I didn't really feel like that was such a good choice here. Let's see how else you could have said it. You could have said owned and rented accommodation. Let me just take one more look at what the prompt says. Households in owned and rented accommodation. Okay. Yeah, so I can see that you might want to change some of this around. Let's see if we can come up with something else. I think that rather than changing the word owned, that maybe you could have changed some other vocabulary around, and that would have been more effective. So why don't we try this? The bar chart demonstrates the proportion of owned versus rented homes in England and Wales from 1918 to 2011. Okay, so instead I changed some other words around. I changed accommodation and I made it homes, and then I left owned as it was. So I think that's fine. Okay, and then before 1971, and it's not really a rate. I don't know if that's the best word here. Maybe you could have said instead the figure. A figure is a great word when you want to avoid repeating, say, for example, percentage or proportion, as I just used before. Or you could have said a percentage, since I think I changed that in the previous sentence. So before 1971, the proportion of owned houses was larger than that of rented. Okay, so you didn't have to say one because this is an example of cohesion. You're using ellipsis here. It's implied that you're talking about rented houses. Okay? Okay, so now here you used on the contrary, and a lot of people use on the contrary inappropriately, and I think that's what's happened here. You don't want to use on the contrary here. Instead, you want to use in contrast. Okay, which is much more appropriate in this case. So in contrast, after 1971, the situation became completely opposite. Okay, and that's fine. Let's look at your detail paragraphs. From 1918 to 1961, most people in England and Wales rented their house instead of having one. Well, careful here. What does it mean to have one? So a better word here would have been owning. Okay, so they rented their house instead of owning one. In 1918, the percentages, well, it's not the percentages plural, it's the percentage. It's 1% in 1918, right? So the percentage of households in rented, you could have said houses or homes, or or accommodation actually. So the percentage of households in rented accommodation was significantly higher than that of households in owned houses, which was around 80 and 20% respectively. Okay, so basically you've told us here, you've given us some information about 1918 to 1961, so this part of the graph right here, where rented homes were more than owned homes. You told us what that beginning figure was, but you don't give us any other figures for um, those years in question. All right, but let's see what you wrote after that. In 1971, you don't want to say in then, and you don't want this comma here, so let's change that. 1971 was the year that both rates reached the same number. It's not really number, okay, because we're talking about percentages, so you don't want to refer to percentages as number. You could say instead figure, or you could have said percentage. So 1971 was the year when both rates reached the same figure, and I would probably put a colon here, 50% for both types of owning status. However, the percentage of households in rented accommodation continued to decline from 1981 to 2011. In 2001, there was a significance between the two percentages, which was almost 30% in rates. I don't understand that. Of household and rented accommodation. Okay. And around 70% in the percentage of households in owned accommodation. Okay, so what I'm really seeing here is not a whole ton of detail as far as the data is concerned. You've really essentially given us data for the beginning, okay? You gave us data here. You gave us data in 2001, okay? And then, of course, in 1971. And then after that, we really don't have a ton of information, okay? We do know that after 1971, rented accommodation declined, but you haven't given us any figures for that at all, okay? Just that one thing here in 2001. And I also thought that you were very, we had very little information about the first part of the data. So we had that figure for 1918, but after that, we really don't know anything. Okay, we don't know how quickly these declines were, or how sharp these increases were. So we're really left with a very limited picture here. Okay, and that's absolutely going to affect your task achievement score. Okay, because how well you develop this is essentially what is one of the things that makes up your score for task achievement. Okay, so I would have liked a little more information, and it's not really complicated here. So what I want to suggest to you is that for the households, let's see, what did you tell me? The left bar is owned accommodation. All right, so let's pretend we're going to start with the right bar. So I would have started probably by saying that in 1918, almost 80% of homes in Wales and England were rented. This figure declined in the next 2 years in question to just under 70%. This decline continued until it reached 50% in 1971. Okay, so you don't have to say a ton, but you do want to give some data here. Okay, so now we know that it's under 70% for those 2 years, and then we know that in 1971 it fell here. So you could leave that out as long as you imply or say that there's some sort of a decline. Okay, and then following that, I still think it's important to mention that there was a decline and that the lowest years in question were in fact not 2011, but they were 1991 and 2001 when the numbers were 30%, okay? But then they rose in the next year. So at the end of the period, the numbers were a little higher. That's another important thing to mention. Okay, so you could have done something like that with the figures for owned accommodation. Okay, so I just wanted to give you an idea about how you could do this. I'm not suggesting that you mention every single piece of data. You certainly don't want to do that because you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You've got 18 pieces of information here. So you certainly don't have to mention all of them, but you do have to give at least a good portion of the information here. Otherwise, it feels rather underdeveloped. All right, so I thought that, most of the grammar was fine. I thought that some of your vocabulary was a little repetitive. I would have liked to have seen maybe some different phrasing, maybe some different lexical resource so that it didn't feel so repetitive as far as the vocabulary is concerned. You can see that when I was describing the chart in my own words, I did use some different words that I think you hadn't used. So maybe that can give you some ideas of the kind of language you want to use here. But I thought grammar was pretty good, except for some of your comparisons rented one higher than the one. So there are other ways of doing this that show a little more, a little higher level grammar. Okay? So with that, that brings us to the end of this correction. I hope you found it helpful. I would love to continue working with you. I think that with continued feedback and, with more practice, that you can certainly get the score that you need in IELTS. I definitely want to see what you're doing with task 2 to see, if there are any things that we need to discuss, there anything that we need to look at in order to help you reach your IELTS goal. So there are a couple of ways that we can continue working together. One is through the online course, which is very comprehensive, tells you everything you need to know to do well in IELTS. And then, of course, there's the essay correction packages, which, may fit your needs as well. So see what works for you best, and I hope we can work with you to get ready for IELTS. Best of luck to you.